They left his grandmother at the airport as if she were forgotten luggage. No tears, no second glance. Just a mumbled excuse and hurried footsteps toward a terminal she would never reach. But Jace Carter, whom they had long treated as the family's shame, turned back. He stood frozen that day, the sterile lights of the airport flickering above him like the memories that refused to die. It wasn't just about what they did to her. It was what they always did to people like him, people who didn't fit into their polished narratives. Jace wasn't the successful lawyer like his older brother, or the soft-spoken daughter they paraded at church. He was the gay son, the one they stopped inviting to holidays, the one whose name rarely passed their lips without tension, but he was also the one who stayed. At 24, Jace owned a small cafe named Second Chance in a quiet stretch of Kansas, where wheat fields bent in the wind like soft sighs of forgotten dreams. Most who passed through barely noticed the sign, but to Jace, that place meant everything. It was where he rebuilt himself from the splinters they left behind, where he learned that some scars can bloom into purpose. Still, even in his peaceful routines, certain memories clung like cold shadows. One afternoon, as he was wiping the counter after closing time, a photograph slipped from between the pages of an old recipe book. He paused. It was bent at the corners, sun-faded, but unmistakable. His grandmother Edith, seated on a stiff plastic chair in an airport waiting area, looking small and unsure, with her purse clutched to her chest like a lifeline. She wore her Sunday hat, the one with the pale blue ribbon she never traveled without. Jay stared at the image for a long time. That day had carved itself into his memory with a dull knife. Back then, he had thought it was just poor planning, a misunderstanding. But the older he got, the clearer it became they had planned to leave her. A final act of convenience disguised as care, because Alzheimer's had begun to cloud her mind. And they didn't want the burden. They called it a family trip, a safari vacation they would all remember. But what they had orchestrated was an abandonment wrapped in fake smiles and printed itineraries. 17 was too young to understand betrayal. But now, the man Jace had become couldn't ignore the truth. They left the only person who had never once left him. When he came out, the rejection from his parents was swift and surgical. They called it confusion, a phase. They blamed Edith for being too soft with him. But she never flinched. She still sent him birthday cards in shaky cursive, still called every Sunday, even when the disease began to take her words away. Still remembered how he took his coffee 2 sugars, never cream, to Jace. She wasn't just a grandmother. She was the last bridge that connected him to any sense of family. And now, years later, as he stood in the quiet hum of his cafe, holding the photo of that airport moment, everything came rushing back. The ache, the choice, the truth. He remembered the look in her eyes when she realized she had been left behind. Not confused, not angry, just quietly resigned, like she had seen it coming, like she expected it. Jace hadn't expected it. He had stood there, torn between the family that rejected him and the only person who had ever truly chosen him. And he chose her. That moment changed everything. It wasn't grand or loud, no dramatic confrontation or shouts across the terminal, just footsteps in reverse, a quiet turning around, and the start of something real. Because sometimes love isn't about being chosen by the many. It's about choosing the one who never stopped loving you. If you've ever felt like the one left behind, remember you still have the power to choose differently, to break the pattern, to be the love someone else needs. Subscribe to Heart Story for more stories that speak to the quiet heroes, the unseen hearts, and the ones brave enough to stay when others walk away. It was meant to be a vacation. That's how they described it. A safari trip to Africa. A family experience before life got too busy again. Abby, his sister, had texted days before, "We want to do this, right? One last adventure with Grandma while she can still recognize us?" The message had felt strange then, and even stranger now in retrospect. Jace had agreed to come, partly out of guilt, partly because Edith had asked if he would. Her voice had trembled when she said she didn't want to forget him in a foreign place. He couldn't say no. The airport was crowded with the noise of people in transit, families hugging tightly, babies crying, luggage wheels scraping tile. But Jace noticed other things that didn't make noise but shouted nonetheless. His father whispering to his mother at the check-in counter, their eyes avoiding his. Abby's nervous glances, the way she kept adjusting her sleeve without reason, and Edith, seated quietly in a wheelchair, her hands twitching slightly in her lap, her hat too big for her head now, slipping forward every time she nodded off. There was something rehearsed in how they moved, too smooth, too efficient. Jace didn't realize what was happening until it was already happening. The boarding announcement was called. Group after group rose and disappeared past the glass. His father stood up, reached for his carry-on, and said to Edith, "Just sit here. We'll be back after check-in." The way someone might say it to a suitcase, a coat, a forgotten object. No goodbye. No touch of the hand. Jace remained frozen. He had risen with the group, ticket in hand, but now stood still as the last call echoed over the intercom. One step toward the gate meant following them. One step back meant choosing her. He turned around. Edith was still seated, alone. The crowd had shifted, revealing her more clearly now, an elderly woman in a wheelchair, blinking slowly, her mouth opening to say something and then stopping. Jace approached and knelt beside her. Her eyes met his. "Where did they go?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jace could have lied. Could have said they got delayed, that they were checking in still, that they'd be back soon. But instead, he took her trembling hand and said the only thing that mattered. "I'm not going anywhere without you." They sat together long after the flight departed. Silence surrounded them, but it wasn't empty. It was full of pain, of betrayal, of a strange kind of peace. The peace that comes from naming the wound, even if it's still bleeding. Later, in a small cafe inside the airport, he bought her tea and a blueberry muffin she barely touched. She stared at the floor, her mouth moving wordlessly. He tried not to let the anger in, but it was there. How could they leave her? How could they do it so easily, so surgically, like it was just logistics they had planned it? Every part of it, and somehow, they had assumed he would go along, but he didn't. They spent the night at a cheap hotel not far from the terminal, one of those places with thin walls and vending machines that sold old crackers. Jace held her hand until she fell asleep. She mumbled once in the night, calling for her mother. In the morning, the world felt quiet, and in that quiet, Jace made a decision not out of anger, not out of martyrdom, but out of love. Love that had not been returned by the ones who should have offered it, but love that still existed, not in ceremony, not in blood, but in action. He called Walter, Edith's younger brother, a man Jace barely knew but whose voice cracked the moment he heard the story. "Bring her home," Walter said. "You both have a place here. You always have." There is something sacred in the moment a person chooses to break the cycle. Jace didn't just walk away from a trip. He walked away from an inheritance of coldness, from a legacy of convenience. He chose something harder, something braver, because sometimes the most courageous act is not confrontation, but kindness in the face of cruelty. And sometimes, the ones who are seen as burdens are the only ones worth carrying. They left the airport before sunrise, when the city still held its breath and the streets felt hollow. Jace had barely slept, his thoughts tangled with what-ifs and half-formed memories. But Edith was calm. She sat by the window of the rideshare, hands folded in her lap, gazing at a world she barely recognized. Her reflection in the glass flickered between past and present, between a woman who once held her family together and one they now saw as disposable. The driver asked where they were heading. Jace answered simply, the Greyhound station. It wasn't a glamorous solution, but it was real, reliable, a way forward. Jace had called Walter the night before. He hadn't expected much. A strained conversation, perhaps, a distant apology. But when the older man picked up and heard Jace's voice, he broke down. "You bring her to me," he said. "You both have always been welcome. They may have forgotten that, but I haven't." Walter lived in a small town nestled between fields and silence, the kind of place that time didn't chase. It felt far enough to matter, far enough to be safe. At the bus terminal, Jace bought 2 tickets and a bottle of water. Edith sat beside him, occasionally humming a tune without words. He didn't know if she remembered where they were going or why, but she seemed less tense now, less uncertain. They boarded quietly. The seats smelled like old fabric and long stories. Outside, the city dissolved into countryside. Mile by mile, the noise faded. Somewhere near the state line, Edith stirred. She turned to him, blinking as if trying to place a memory. "Jace," she said softly. He looked at her, unsure at first if he'd imagined it. But then she smiled, not wide, not confident, but real. "I didn't forget you." His chest tightened. It was the first time she'd called his name in over a year, and though her eyes still carried fog, in that moment, there was light. Tears welled at the edges of his vision, not from sadness, but from the confirmation that something deeper than memory still remained. Alzheimer's might take the names, the routines, the stories, but it hadn't taken love. Not yet. He reached over and held her hand. She didn't pull away. They passed empty farms and rusting silos, the hum of the bus, the faint chatter from other passengers, the rhythm of road against rubber, all of it blurred into the background. What mattered was sitting beside him, still wearing the blue ribbon hat, still humming fragments of lullabies he didn't realize she had once sung him as a child. By late afternoon, they arrived. Walter stood near the edge of the terminal lot, his frame thinner than Jace remembered, his hair fully gray now, but his posture steady. When he saw them, he didn't hesitate. He walked straight to Edith, dropped to one knee, and kissed her hand. "Welcome home, big sister," he whispered. Edith blinked, then laughed a small, breathy sound, but joyful. Walter embraced Jace like a son. No questions, no hesitations, only warmth. Mary, Walter's wife, greeted them at the house with open arms. She'd made a bed for Edith by the window, filled the room with flowers and soft blankets. That night, over a simple dinner, they talked. Not about the betrayal, not about what the rest of the family had done, but about what came next. About gardens and early morning walks, about building something new. For the first time in years, Jace didn't feel like a guest in someone else's story. He felt chosen. Sometimes, family isn't the people who share your blood it's the ones who show up when everything else falls apart. The ones who stay not because they have to, but because they choose to. And sometimes, even in a fading mind, the heart remembers exactly who's worth remembering. Life with Walter and Mary settled into a gentle rhythm, one that didn't demand explanations or apologies. Their home smelled like cedarwood and rising bread, a place where silence was never awkward, only restful. Edith spent most of her days near the sunroom, wrapped in soft quilts, watching birds flutter across the fields. On good days, she recognized faces. On others, she drifted through conversations like a passenger on a slow-moving train. But she was safe. And Jace was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. He helped around the property, tending the small garden behind the house, fixing what needed fixing, and often sitting with Edith for hours, just being present. There was no rush, no judgment, no performance. For the first time in years, he felt like he was allowed to exhale. One evening, Walter asked Jace to follow him to the barn. The structure had stood for generations, weathered, strong, practical. Inside, beneath a heavy canvas tarp and behind a stack of old tools, Walter pulled out a small iron box. It was rusted at the corners but locked tight. He handed it over with care. "She gave me this a few years ago." Walter said, "Told me not to open it unless she couldn't say the words herself." Jace didn't know what to expect. When he opened it, the scent of aged paper rose into the air. Inside were deeds to several acres of farmland, a stack of savings bonds, a thick folder of bank documents, and a slim black notebook with Edith's initials in faded gold. Every document was in her name, but scribbled across the top of each was a note in her handwriting, for Jace. Walter stood quietly as Jace sifted through it, not interrupting. "She wanted you to have everything," Walter said at last. "She said no one else had earned it, not through blood, but through love." Jace couldn't speak. He felt the weight of generations, of history, of the quiet power of a woman who had been cast aside and yet had never stopped protecting him. Later that week, a local attorney visited the house. Edith, surprisingly lucid that day, sat upright with a soft blanket around her shoulders and signed the final papers with a shaky but determined hand. Her eyes didn't waver, Not even once. The attorney confirmed what the documents already suggested. Edith had legally named Jace her sole heir. Her explanation was brief, but powerful. "He's my family," she said. He stayed. No one objected. No one contested, because the truth was unshakable. Jace didn't ask for any of it. He didn't even realize how much she had prepared behind the scenes. But Edith had watched, listened, understood. She had seen him carry what others discarded, love through what others fled from, and in return, she gave him everything because she believed he was the one who would carry it with care. Even Mary, who barely knew Jace before all this, wrapped her arms around him afterward and whispered, "She saw you. We all do now." Jace returned to the cafe idea slowly. He didn't want the money for indulgence. He wanted it to mean something permanent, a place not just to remember her, but to live by what she taught him, that love, when chosen freely, holds more weight than inheritance, more power than tradition. In that quiet home, surrounded by people who never asked him to change, Jace began to understand something vital, that being seen for who you truly are is the greatest form of wealth. What Edith gave him wasn't just property or money, it was permission to live, to heal, to lead with love, even in a world that too often labels softness as weakness. And sometimes, the real legacy is not what's written in a will, but the quiet decision to trust someone with your name, your story, your hope. A month after Edith passed, Jace stood in front of a small storefront across from the Greyhound station. The glass was dusty, the paint chipped, but he saw something in it, something quiet, strong, and full of possibility. He signed the lease with hands that still trembled from grief, then began building the cafe he'd always dreamed of. He named it Second Chance. He chose the name not just because he got one, but because she gave him his inside. The walls were warm wood and soft light. The smell of cinnamon and espresso greeted every visitor. A photo of Edith in her Sunday hat hung near the front window, framed simply, as if to say she was still watching, still here. Regulars came and went, travelers between towns, people looking for connection, students who stayed too long with one cup of tea. Jace welcomed all of them. He remembered names, how they took their coffee, whether they were smiling for real or just pretending. And every time he wiped a table clean, he thought about that airport, about how some people choose to stay behind for love. A week after the funeral, Jace returned to Walter's house to collect the last of Edith's belongings. Mary handed him a small wooden box. "We found this in her sewing table," she said. "She wanted you to have it." Inside was a folded letter, yellowed at the edges, tied with a single blue ribbon. On the outside, in shaky cursive, it read, "For Jace, when you're ready to forgive the world." He read it slowly, alone, in the quiet of the cafe as rain tapped against the window pane. "Dear Jace, if you're reading this, then I'm already resting somewhere I hope is gentle. I want to say I'm sorry. Not for loving you, but for not being louder about it. I saw what they did to you. I saw how you folded into yourself to survive it. I should have said more. I should have stood between you and the storm. But I need you to know, loving you never felt like a choice. It was the truest thing I ever did. You didn't open a cafe just to sell coffee. You opened a door for people like you, for those who've been told they're too much, too different, too soft. For the ones who've been left behind with no map back, I'm proud of you. You did something the rest of them never had the courage to do. You chose love over fear. Keep doing that. The world may never deserve your heart, but someone will. And they'll know how rare it is. Love always. Grandma Edith. Jace folded the letter and placed it inside a glass frame next to the register. He didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, he lit a small candle and brewed a pot of coffee using her favorite roast. Customers came in. He greeted them, laughed with them, sat with them. Outside, the sun broke through a week of clouds. Inside, love lingered. Some people say family is who raises you, but sometimes, family is who sees you when the world refuses to. Sometimes, the ones we expect the least from become the ones who save us. And sometimes, the people they called burdens are the ones who carry everyone else forward. Have you ever been made to feel like a burden, only to find out you were someone's biggest blessing? Tell us in the comments. Your story might be someone else's second chance. Subscribe to Heart Story for more stories of healing, hope, and the quiet kind of courage that changes everything.